Since the passing of the Biologics Price Competition and Innovation Act in 2010, the FDA has approved over 70 biosimilar medicines. And since their entry to market in 2015, biosimilars have generated $36 billion in savings for America's patients and the U.S. healthcare system. Biosimilars have proven they can unlock access to safe, effective, and more affordable treatments. But unfortunately, a dangerous trend threatens to halt progress related to biosimilar uptake and patient access. In February 2025, an analysis from the IQVIA Institute revealed a massive biosimilar void. A staggering 90% of biologic drugs losing patent exclusivity over the next 10 years have no biosimilar competition in the pipeline. This data underscores a flawed system that limits patient access and negatively impacts the livelihood of millions of Americans. However, when it comes to biosimilars, we have the tools to fix the problem. With the right focus, collaboration, and reforms, we can ensure biosimilars continue to bring value to patients, providers, and the broader healthcare system. With thanks to the Center for Biosimilars, this podcast series explores the current biosimilars landscape, dives into urgent actions needed from policymakers and regulators, and offers real-world insights into what changes are needed now to ensure the sustainability of the industry. Welcome to Escaping the Void, all things biosimilars with Craig and G. Now, let's meet your hosts.
Hey, everyone. I'm Craig Burton. I'm the Senior Vice President for Policy and Allies here at the Association for Accessible Medicines. I'm also the Executive Director of the Biosimilars Council, which is a division of AAM, and I'm joined by my colleague, G.
Hi, everyone. Giuseppe Randazzo. I'm Senior Vice President of Science and Regulatory Affairs, and we work hand in hand with Craig and the others in the council on all things biosimilars.
Well, great. Well, G, let's jump in. As Ashley mentioned in the introduction, there's been a lot of focus this year on the report that the IQVIA Institute released, talking about where we stand on biosimilars. The report found that while we've made a lot of progress today, we've had $36 billion in savings through biosimilars. One of the stats that I love to come back to is the fact that in markets where biosimilars have launched, we've seen more utilization, almost 500 million days of patient therapy that would not have occurred without biosimilar competition. So there are definitely some good news stories, but the Void paper kind of highlights some of the challenges as well. And you and I both just got back from the Festival of Biologics, where there was a lot of discussion from healthcare providers, manufacturers on what's happening in the biosimilars market and where we are, where we're going from here. What jumped out at you from the conversations last week?
Well, I would say this before I tell you about, to me, what jumped out. I just want to say that I'm a little surprised. I did not think my first podcast or series of podcasts would be about biosimilars. I thought maybe football, maybe something else, but this is fun too. And when I told my kids I was doing biosimilars, they said, "What?" At any rate, to your question, Craig, I guess what didn't surprise me was there were a lot of repeating themes.
Yeah.
And for me, on the science and regulatory affairs side, I looked to and I hung on to the streamlining elements. And there were many talks that talked about streamlining. And of course, they weaved into it adoption, et cetera. And of course, we did the development and the idea of, will products be developed in the future, these next 10 years, as you talked about already, and you will continue to talk about. But the streamlining piece was big. And what small changes specifically, and or dare I say, some robust changes that we might be able to keep it simple, to make it easier, more efficient, faster for companies to develop products. And of course, even on the FDA side to help assess the products too. And we'll get to it, I'm sure, later. But one of them, of course, is the clinical efficacy studies, right? The limitations or the lack of the need for that, thankfully. And I think a lot of the agencies like the FDA, EMEA recently out with a reflection paper is moving in the right direction for limiting the use of those. Global comparators, of course, was discussed, but of those two, I think most was chatted about was definitely the clinical efficacy studies, which is a really good thing.
Yeah, no, definitely a lot of And you're right. It was a really interesting dynamic. People kept coming back to, and I've seen that in the past, but the what they keep coming back to kind of changes every year. And so definitely a lot of streamlining conversation this year.
Void.
A lot of void. I think had just about every speaker referenced that void paper. Yeah, I heard a lot of discussion about just the theme of sustainability.
Yep.
Fair. Is this sustainable in the way that it's set up in the long run? Whether we're talking about the development cost or whether we're talking about the return on investment and whether it's sustainable pricing mechanism. So definitely heard a lot on that sense. But maybe let's start. I mean, you brought up streamlining. Kind of for folks who are not in the weeds on this, what do we mean by streamlining?
So streamlining to me, just to keep it very simple, high level, it's just how do we make the process more efficient? And again, I'll focus first on industry, of course, and mainly on industry regarding the streamlining. Is the concept of how can we remove some, dare I say, antiquated type of quote unquote requirements that maybe aren't needed anymore. So the easy one, once again, the one that was talked about quite often, are those clinical efficacy studies. And the idea here with that is, 20 years ago, when we started having conversations about this, and of course the passing of, BBCIA and others, we weren't as confident in some of these scientific tools. And they were good, don't get me wrong, but what's happened in the last 10, 15 years, 20 years, the robustness of these tools, analytical tools, whether it's structural or functional assays, we can actually use analytical science, the analytical tools to prove products are highly similar versus having to put products into patients at different phases of development. So that in itself will save you a tremendous amount of time. If we could show, in fact, it's an easy argument to make that the scientific analytical tools are more robust and will tell you more than the human clinical trials will tell you. So from our perspective, we think these are not needed. And that would save not only a tremendous amount of time, but also a tremendous amount of money, which links it back to the void that maybe we can see more developers say, okay, well, I'm not going to have this cost now that would have normally cost me X amount of dollars because I don't have to do a clinical F study. Let's see if I can really dip into and consider researching and developing an asset like that.
So arguably streamlining allows you to get products to the market, more safely,
Ideally.
and more affordably. Yes.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'd say one thing that I want to say what it isn't too, and he nailed it as far as the simplicity of streamlining, just creating efficiency so we can get products to the market faster and to patients faster. But I will mention this. We don't want people to think at all, whether you're in the business, and of course, just watching this podcast or listening because it's very entertaining. We don't want you to think at all that streamlining is reducing the quality, not even remotely. It's without question the bar of safety, quality, and efficacy remains high from the FDA perspective. So streamlining does not reduce any type of safety, quality, and efficacy. It actually remains high. So that's one thing streamlining isn't. We make sure the FDA has their authority and continues to look at, review, and approve high quality biosimilars.
Yeah, I mean, definitely FDA remains the gold standard in terms of ensuring the safety of medicines. And so definitely keep FDA, ensure they have the tools they need, but let's bring this into the 21st century, and find ways to do this, more efficient. Seems to be a buzzword these days.
Right.
Can you talk about why? So you talked about why we can actually do this more safely. Talk about why it's cheaper. Where is the cost when you think about the development of these products?
Sure. I'll say a couple things. One, before I get there and let me table that, Craig, I just want to mention one thing. We kind of see history repeating itself. I think when generics were introduced years and years ago, it was similar in this vein regarding they had to do more to get a product to market. Then over time, there was trust in that process, trust in the science.
Yeah.
I think that's where we are from a biosimilar perspective. In fact, some would call it biogenerics. I'm not saying I would use that term, but some may. Regarding cost, I think there's a few main costs here. One specifically is it costs money to obtain those reference products, right? So you got to pay for the reference products, and that's not trivial. It's a large amount of money that they pay.
And you're not getting a discount.
No, you're not kidding. It's
Price full freight.
exactly right. It's exactly right. So it costs money to obtain that and to do your studies, do earlier on studies, if you had to do, we won't get into it this time, interchangeability, switching studies, it costs even more to get more of that product. So that's one, obtaining the product or the reference, what we call the reference biologic product. That's a cost, but also the cost of clinical trials itself.
Yeah.
Now you have to go through the process of securing patient participants, the IRB. There's a huge logistical cost in this, and it's a fair amount of time. If and when developers go through the process of clinical assay studies, it's not like they do all this research and all these analytical tests first, and they go, okay, now we're good. In the years, then boom, clinical study. It's almost in parallel. So they're doing this for a long period of time. So I think those are two of the main costs: acquiring reference products and that maintains, and then also the clinical trial itself, which all clinical trials again aren't trivial costs; they're expensive.
Yeah, I love how you kind of talk about the length of this because I think there's a view out there that this is real quick, easy, and I don't think people understand that with biosimilars, we're talking about a 6, 7, 8, 9 year development pathway and a cost of as much as $300 million or more.
The numbers I've seen.
So it's basically on par with developing a new branded product. With all the costs that goes into that.
Yep.
So
And yet not only that, to your point, and this is something we'll probably maybe get on in subsequent podcasts, is the marketed side. Once you are marketing, it is closer to the brand type of model than generic. So there's that cost there too. You have to think about when you're developing a product.
Yeah, and I think that's where bringing it where folks kept bringing it back to the void. Right there, if you look at the paper that IQVIA put out, and I think we are going to have a deeper dive episode focused on that paper. But if you look at that, there are a lot of products with annual sales of $2-3 billion a year, and that's not nothing.
No,
and that do not have biosimilars in development. So I think your point is if we can reduce the cost of development, then hopefully that makes developing lower cost options for those products more attainable.
I think that's right. And also I would add one more variable is predictability. If you had that predictability, if you know exactly what's going to be required and stuff like that, it's less of a risk. You know what the FDA, as we're speaking of this agency, of course, you know what the expectation will be.
Yeah.
That predictability is also very helpful.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously, look, we're not talking about developing products for product's sake here. We're talking about lower price products to help patients. And without these, you have patients who are going to be stuck with higher priced products for the foreseeable future. And you're not fulfilling the promise and the potential of biosimilars.
I think that's great. Of course, our organization is the Association for Accessible Medicines, and that's holistic, generic, and biosimilars. And the reason I bring it up is the point you're making. It's about accessibility, right? The first thing you do is to have those products. Once you have those products, and then the next step is, of course, let's make them accessible. Make sure they're accessible to patients who need them.
Yeah, totally. Good. So a lot is on streamlining.
Yep.
While we're on the regulatory front, you mentioned global comparator. What on earth is global comparator?
Yeah, it's pretty. I'll keep it very, very simple. The idea here is, currently the way it's structured is you'll have to do analytical tests with products, not just in not one authority. For example, if you're using it, the goal is this: if we have global companies, right? And they manufacture products in certain parts of the globe, and the product that's essentially approved and used in the EU is the same product that's used here. So if you have a reference product that's approved, I shouldn't have to test my biosimilar with the U.S. reference product, and then again test my biosimilar with the EU reference product. It just doesn't seem to make sense. So the idea is, how can we align? And again, the agencies and others are thinking more about this, and if we can prove that they're the same, which they effectively are, just testing it once just makes a little more sense. It just seems to repeat that is, again, costly, timely, and just doesn't seem to make sense.
Good deal.
Let me, I know we're not done with streamlining, but let me talk about and throw the ball to you for a little bit and talk about some of the void and talk about beyond streamlining, unless you want to put a bow on this for a second, because I talked about what it is briefly. Do you want to add anything before I get to you in the void? Do you want to add anything on like what streamlining in your mind is or isn't, or we hit all the highlights?
No, I think you hit the highlights. I mean, I think to me as the non-regulatory, non-science person, I think it comes back to efficiency, predictability, yeah, safer and cheaper product.
Yeah, that's fair. So I appreciate it. So let me throw it to you. So tell me, we talked about, of course, I mentioned void almost every slide. We talked about streamlining. So at Festival of Biologics, since you said you saw a lot about the void, it was mentioned again in almost every talk. Can you tell me a little bit more about what you felt you heard mostly out there about the void?
Yeah, I think broadly it was this idea of sustainability.
Yeah.
Right. So there's a lot going into why we have the void. Some of it is the cost of development. Some of it is people are still learning these products, undoubtedly. But some of it is that let's be blunt. So far, the adoption and marketing of biosimilars has been rocky, to be kind. We've seen recently rapid adoption in some biosimilar classes. But even in those classes, we're seeing that rapid adoption and we're seeing the prices fall so quickly that we're not sure that's sustainable as a long-term policy.
Craig, let me ask you, why are we, do you believe we're seeing some of those prices drop so rapidly?
Yeah. So, or you could even say, why are low prices bad? Right. Look, low prices are good, and this is not to suggest that. I think we all want lower costs. That's why we're doing all this work. But in the medical benefit, these are the biosimilars to treat cancer. These are products that are infused where you go into a hospital, you go into a clinic, the physician, the healthcare provider purchases the product, administers it to you, and then they're reimbursed for it.
So I'm going to jump again. I mean, okay, medical benefit, you explained it. That was very helpful. So when you say medical benefit, you described it almost an infusion center, for example.
Yeah, you very much.
There's there's something else?
There is a difference.
Okay.
There's also pharmacy benefit.
All right.
That's you go to your local grocery store pharmacy, your CVS, your Walgreens, wherever that is, or you get it in the mail.
Okay.
These are products that you might administer on your own to yourself. These are products like insulin and Humira are right now the two best examples of that in the biosimilar space. Now, those two different markets have different dynamics and different challenges. In the pharmacy benefit market, there's been a lot of attention on that the last couple of years with the launch of Humira.
Yeah.
Best-selling drug, I believe, in history.
Might be.
And with revenues exceeding that of the National Football League,
Which is a lot.
it's a lot. And a lot of people were looking at the launch of biosimilar versions of Humira as an inflection point for the market. It's been a slow inflection point.
Yeah.
And right now, the biosimilar share appears to be at around 20%. And we're now, about 2 years into that market.
So wait. So, okay, so there's one product out there, a reference product out there, and there's biosimilars out there. It's been out there for 2 years. When I say has there only one or two? There's multiple, right?
There are 10 manufacturers.
Okay, so there's a lot.
There are 22 different price points for biosimilar versions with prices that are as much as 85 to 90% lower than the brand drug, than the brand product, and yet that brand still controls 80% of that market.
So it's not for a lack of competition. Plenty of others out there. It's not for a lack of lower price. It must be something else.
We believe it comes back to the value of rebates to PBMs that are controlling those formularies. Unfortunately, the healthcare system right now is designed in a way, because of what Congress and CMS have done unintentionally, but nonetheless, they have put in place and left in place incentives that reward PBMs, that reward these middlemen when they use and drive use of higher priced medicines. And so that is certainly a challenge facing biosimilars in the pharmacy benefit market. So as we think about the void, you're thinking about developing products, and can you do it quickly and efficiently and affordably? But you also want to make sure you're going to be able to get sales of the product and adoption. So sure.
That's very helpful. Very interesting too. I learn from you every day on all that. I appreciate you simplifying it for me, because you said it a million times. I keep meeting you here at the medical benefit, pharmacy benefits. It's very helpful.
Yeah.
All right. I think, Craig, at this point, we are totally off script.
That's all right. So the other side of it is the medical benefit.
Thank you. Sorry. Yes.
No, you're good. So the other side of it is the medical benefit. This is, as I said, you go into an infusion center.
Yeah.
The doctor buys, they bill then back for use of that product, and they're paid based on average sales price. Okay. Well, unfortunately, they're reimbursed based on average sales price, but that's not necessarily what they buy the drug for.
Right.
And so, and they're reimbursed based on a 2-quarter, so 6-month lag. So what they pay for a drug could be less than what they're reimbursed for this.
So they pay for a drug in July of 2024. December-ish of 2024 or January 2025, they get reimbursed.
Or they get reimbursed, but based on a payment based on a rate that's low 6 months later or later.
I'm sorry.
So it means they may hypothetically spend $100, for instance, but get reimbursed $90. Now that's what we mean when we say underwater.
Yeah.
And I had the opportunity to testify 2 or 3 weeks ago in front of House Ways and Means Committee on the state of the biosimilars market, and I was sitting next to me was an oncologist, as well as an immunologist, both of whom talked about the challenge that poses to their ability to keep using the lower cost medicines, and could actually drive healthcare providers to use higher priced medicines, which is presumably not the intent.
Right.
That's what's happening.
Right.
So,
and speaking of that, as far as cost, price, etc., tell me about this. The we mentioned earlier already IRA, and may not have to do too much, but as far as part of it, we've talked about it outside of this podcast, but IRAs, maximum fair price provisions or price controls, and potentially eroding the predictability, right?
yeah.
Can you tell me a little more about that?
Yeah, so the IRA gives HHS it actually mandates that HHS negotiate the prices of certain brand drugs each year. These are drugs that do not yet have biosimilar competition or generic competition. Okay, so shouldn't affect biosimilars, right? Theoretically. The challenge is that you touched on the key point, which is predictability, right? So what does any business crave more than anything in the world? Right? It's predictability.
Right.
You need to know who your customers are, what you're going to be able to price, what market you're collect, right? So you talked a few minutes ago about how long the development process is. 8 to 9 years. $300 million. you as a biosimilar developer are making that decision to invest in a new biosimilar way back.
Yeah.
At say year 2
Right.
of a brand biologic. Uh, um, Even if you assume, which in my view you should assume that that brand biologic is going to be negotiated years later.
Right.
It won't start that negotiation period until year 11. So you're having to make a guess way back here about a negotiated price
Right.
going to be set according to an unknown, unclear, easily changed standard that will be implemented 10 years from now. Unless you have a crystal ball, I don't see how you could do it. So let me actually put it in other terms. You're having to guess what party and what president will be in charge 10 years from now, and what their drug pricing policies are going to be at that time in estimating your investment in a new biosimilar. That's pretty doggone difficult. If recent history has shown us nothing, that's going to be difficult to predict. And so certainly I think it's one more reason you see these biosimilars with $2 and $3 billion annual sales that don't have, or the brand biologics with $2 or $3 billion in annual sales.
Right.
Have biosimilars in development.
And that rounds us back to, it brings us back to, like you said, and like we talked about earlier, as far as, it's not even predictability the next year or 2 years. Like, you have to be able to make a risk sort of a risk assessment as a business, because it is a business. And of course, it's a good business because we provide great healthcare, great products. You're helping society. But of course, these companies still need to make money.
Yeah.
You get it.
Right.
But you have to make that determination with all these variables that may in fact change, not only year to year, but 10 years from now. Okay, we do it. So when you say it that way, you think about that, it makes sense. Unfortunately, it makes sense as far as the challenge. Now the idea, and what we'll probably dive into, I hope, in the next few podcasts, is maybe some ideas around this. We'll go into more of this, and like I said, we touched upon a lot of things today, probably a little off script. We'll go into more of this in subsequent podcasts. We'll talk maybe about more of some of the ideas and how we can continue this conversation into increasing predictability, into moderate but reasonable regulatory requirements for approval and review. And then, of course, on the payer side, you're going to be talking about a lot of things. And it's great for me because I get to learn, which is very helpful.
There you go. So maybe we can start to wrap it up. For final words from you, maybe what, a good word about where we are on the science and regulatory side of biosimilars.
Yeah.
And then kind of what's the takeaway that people should be paying attention to as we dive into this year.
Sure, I would say a good point where we are is like a lot of signs are moving in the right direction. We talk about sustainability, and we talk two of the elements. One specific, we mentioned, of course, the clinical efficacy studies. We've seen really good progress in let's say, a shift of thinking from two of the major health authorities, FDA and EMA, like I said, EMA, that are moving in that direction. So that's a really positive thing. It's really good for many of us because ideally that will entice companies to look at that void, to look at that, and we mentioned those numbers, look at those 112 products that may not be in development, to say, okay, now we might think about going after some of this. So that is the hope. That's the hope. And that's something we have to keep looking out for. I forget the second part of your question, which I'm glad because I can stop.
I think you did it. I thought Kevin's driving something. I covered it. Yeah, no, I would build on that. I mean, I mentioned at the beginning, where on the positive, and we actually had a great speaker last week who made a really good point that so often when we talk about this, we focus on the negative.
Yeah, the barrier. Right.
And we don't celebrate the progress we've made. And look, I think the highlight is that, as I mentioned, biosimilars are expanding patient access to care. 500 million days of patient therapy that would not have occurred That's why we're doing this. I think to your point, the science is evolving. We know a lot more today. And we're seeing the medical community really respond in a strong way. Providers, strong proponents of biosimilars, and I think that's huge. I think we just have to keep working with industry, with providers, and frankly with policymakers to make sure that we have the incentives set up so that the market works as everyone wants it to work.
I think that's right. And one more thing, and I'll give it back just in case, but I think you're right. We've come a long way. We've really come a long way. We've made some incredible gains. And I mentioned we come a long way. We've had some success, and we said, and you're right. You said we have to celebrate those successes. That's correct. But it ain't over. You have to keep working with, like you said, policymakers, working with industry, working with our agencies, working with patients, providers, healthcare providers. All these folks, if they get on the same page, ideally push these things forward for the benefit of, end of the day, benefit of patients.
I couldn't agree more. Well, I think that's a great place to end on. Thanks everyone for joining us. Hope you'll join us in the future. And by all means, reach out to us if you have questions or if we can be helpful as we move forward.
Take care. Thanks all.
Thanks, y'all.